I'm Moni. I'm a 5th-year PhD student in Nelly Andara's Puri's lab. We are a tendon biomechanics lab. My project is looking at the multi-scale mechanical changes that arise from overuse injuries of the tendon and uses a regenerative mouse strain to develop therapeutics in order to improve tendon healing after injury in preclinical models.
And I'm Ben. I'm a 4th year in the Butcher Lab. So Butcher Lab is mostly focused on heart valve development, biomechanics, tissue engineering, and disease development. And I specifically work on the tissue engineering aspect using bioprinting mostly. So I don't do a ton of biomechanics, but I do biomechanical analysis of my tissues that I create. And I have a pretty substantial experience in biomechanics classes at Cornell. So I guess, Moni, do you have any specific topics? I thought we could talk about like classes and like outside resources like the CNF, CCMR, those kinds of things. Do you want to just go ahead and start with classes then? I think that's easy.
Yeah, so you may have already heard that Cornell BME doesn't have too many requirements on particular classes you have to take. It kind of depends on your committee. There's a couple of biomechanics courses that Ben and I have both taken that have been very helpful as far as like more of the rigorous mechanics background that you might need for your research. There's also some more like mechanobiology type courses that are being offered, and I think Carl is actually teaching them since he got here. I'm not super sure actually though. But basically like your committee kind of dictates what classes you'll take. So people who are in the biomechanics labs usually take like the 2 main like mechanics courses just so you know like what's going on in lab and stuff, even if your project doesn't explicitly require it, if you're more on the bio side, for example. But then after that, like it's up to you really, and like you kind of convince your committee whether you do or don't need to take a class, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, and so those 2 main classes that Moni's talking about are called soft tissue 1 and soft tissue 2, I guess. I don't know what the official titles, but they aren't necessarily in order. One is mostly viscoelastic focused and one is more I don't even know what to call it, but
like continuum mechanics.
Continuum mechanics, yeah. That's the should be the title. But yeah, so depending on your advisor, you might have to take one, you might have to take both. And then in terms of mechanobiology courses, I think there's a pretty wide variety at Cornell, even in other departments, especially outside of engineering. So depending on the lab that you end up in, like maybe in Jan's lab, he'll encourage you to take mechanobiology courses, and I'm sure he has a good experience of like which ones are really useful. Other than that, I mean, a lot of classes will do like a really shallow dive into biomechanics, like tissue engineering or courses like that. Biomaterials courses as well.
Everyone takes a stats class for the most part. Well, maybe not everyone, not Ben. But there's like 2 graduate level stats courses, stats 1 and stats 2, which at least in the like if you're in a mechanical engineering affiliated professor's lab, you usually have to take those courses, but they're pretty easy. If you've taken like a stats class before, you'll be fine. Do you want to talk about like your lab space, Ben?
Sure. So our lab is in Weil on the 3rd floor, kind of separate from most of the BME labs in Weil, which are mostly on the 1st floor. We do a lot of different things. So in general, as I said, we study heart valves, but all of the grad students and postdocs study fairly diverse things. So we have a few tissue engineers. I'm really the only one focusing on heart valve tissue engineering. So we all have our own devices and spaces and everything. There are a lot of mechanical testing devices. Since this is biomechanics and mechanobiology, I'll talk a little bit about like testing specifically. I have been able to develop one testing device specifically for my project in our lab. A lot of the other things that I've had to do were at shared, I don't know what to call them, like shared resource lab spaces we can talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so I've had a chance to use some of those, learn how to use those tools. And also, I've also been able to develop things specifically for my project later in my PhD as I got further into knowing what I needed to do and what I needed to actually measure.
I'm, like I said, in Nellie's lab. So she is a mechanical engineering professor. She's like field faculty in BME, and so we are located in Upson Hall, which is over in the engineering quad, not in Weil. And so our lab, Marilane's lab, and Chris's lab, we all share lab space in Upson and Grumman. And so we have like biological facilities like cell culture space and all of that, but we also have a lot of like other wet lab space for like histology or microscopy. And then we also have our own mechanical testing facility to test. If you've seen like the recruitment video that was posted, we can test like at multiple scales. Like some people test like human cadaver size things. I test mouse size things, so it like really spans the whole range. And then there's also a mechanical testing facility in Weil. So Larry Benasser teaches a biomechanics course to undergrads. And so that course like only needs this lab space for like 2 days of the week for like a semester. And so the rest of the time, like anyone can use it. So they have a bunch of mechanical testing machines down there, which is really nice. Like if I'm testing, like I can test like 6 things in parallel then, because I can use like all of these like class lab space basically to get like a lot of testing done really quickly.
And then one of the other resources I wanted, or two of the other resources I wanted to talk about are the Cornell Center for Materials Research and the Center for Nanofabrication. So the Center for Materials Research, called the CCMR, is a shared facility. It has a few different locations throughout campus. I think it's mostly on the engineering quad. But there are lots of really useful shared tools, particularly for like material analysis, mechanical analysis, chemical analysis, things like that. And so you just have to be trained on a certain instrument. It's a little bit different because of COVID, so I haven't used it as much, so I don't know a lot of the details. But so if you just look up like what instruments they have, and you think you might want to try to use it for your samples, you can get one-on-one training with one of the staff there who are very knowledgeable and very helpful. And then they will like guide you through how to do the sorts of tests that you want to do on your samples. So that's a really good way to both learn what's available and learn what works and what doesn't for your sorts of research. And then the other thing is the Center for Nanofabrication, which is in Duffield mostly, I think, on the engineering quad as well. And they're able to do lots of really lots of different manufacturing methods to make either like fluidic systems, testing systems. A lot of the stuff that Jan does, if you see the cells moving through the little mazes, I believe all of that is manufactured at the Center for Nanofabrication. So especially for mechanobiology people who are doing like cellular scales kind of stuff, it's very useful. And I'm pretty sure Claudia Fischbach was just recently appointed the new director. So that's a really good connection that we have with that whole resource. So like a campus-wide resource that one of our professors is the director of now. So both of those are very good resources. Also through the CCMR, I've worked with REU summer students. So they have a summer REU program that I've had a couple students with. So lots of great resources. Lots of great ways to get involved and in the greater like engineering field as well.
There's also 2 other shared core facilities that I use frequently. One of them is the BRC which is the Biotechnology Resource Center. And so they have a lot of like imaging equipment. So like 2-photon microscopes, confocal microscopes, light microscopes, like spinning discs, like every kind of microscope in the world is like at the BRC. They also have like a genomics subcore. So if you want to do like RNA-seq, if you want to do like even like PCR, things like that, like this core, you can like outsource it to the core, so they'll like run it for you, and then you can do the analysis, and they help with like library prep and all of that kind of stuff too. And then the other facility is the animal facility. So if you do any sort of animal work, your animals will be housed in one of two places. One of them is in Weil, and the other one is in a vet school. But in either case, like there is dedicated staff to like take care of your animals and like feed them and make sure they're okay. But then also there are like vets and surgeons who are affiliated with the vet school who can help guide you through if you're doing like a very technically challenging surgery on your mice, or if you're having like problems or issues with like live animal procedures, like they're incredibly helpful with kind of guiding you through that. And they so at these animal facilities, they have animals of like, they have all kinds of animals. So they have like mice and rats, there's fish, there's some dog studies, I believe, rabbits. So depending on like what lab you join, they are very helpful. Like they will be able to accommodate like whatever you get. And like we've gotten some new strains of animals that like haven't traditionally been housed in the animal facility, and they are like very accommodating of like starting like new strains and new lines and things like that. As we're talking, also, if there's like specific questions you have or topics you want us to cover, like feel free to put them in the chat. One other thing I did want to highlight is there's something between all the biomechanics labs called biomechanics meetings, which we haven't been doing since COVID, but I think they're going to start again this year. But normally they're in person on Monday afternoons, and there's free lunch, which is great. But it's my lab, Larry, Marilyn, and Chris, and Butcher's lab used to come, but I don't know. But basically, it's a way for students to present to our peers. It's mostly attended by students, and like the faculty come too, but it's great to practice. Like if you have a conference talk coming up, if you have your A exam or B exam, people practice those, or job talks. Also just like to get feedback. So like it doesn't always have to be a full presentation, oftentimes like just experimental design, things like that. And it's really helpful because the faculty do come. So if they're on your committee, it's like a great way to kind of like meet with them and catch them up on what you've been working on and get feedback too.
Yeah, I think that's all the stuff I had written down.
I did want to also talk about immersion real quick. I think there is a separate panel on immersion, but I just wanted to say the orthopedics labs, so that's my lab, Larry, Chris, and Marilyn, have very well-established connections with HSS, which is a hospital for special surgery. They're the leading orthopedic hospital in the US. And so there are already like collaborations oftentimes set up with the surgeons or scientists there. So it helps to kind of facilitate whatever your interests are working on, like here in Ithaca, when you go over for immersion. So for example, for my project, I work with Scott Rodeo. He's the head physician of the New York Giants. But so he was like incredibly busy, but he's also incredibly knowledgeable and like he's top of his field. So I was working on my project here in Ithaca, which was a like benchtop, like wet lab kind of project, and he has a lab space at HSS. So it was really cool because I was doing my project in rats here, but when I was there for immersion, he was able to get human samples for me, like from surgical biopsies, and I would be like in the OR like with him, and like I'd get to see like, you know, this whole like rotator cuff repair procedure, and then like at the end of it, he'd like give me a tiny little tendon from a very famous person, and like I was like, whoa. But and then I like take it back to the lab, and like I was able to ship all of my materials from Ithaca to HSS, and I was like able to work in lab and like get this whole like project done and ended up presenting it at a conference. But there's people who also like, so in my case, like my mentor was both like my scientific and like my medical mentor, but you can also be like kind of like co-advised for the summer where you shadow a surgeon, but then you work in like an actual research lab under somebody else. And so there's ways to set that up too.
Did you have any other connection with these labs after that? Like after you did the research, are there like any collaborations or anything?
My lab particularly does not. We kind of tried to, it kind of gets, we tried to get like human samples from them, but it ended up being a challenge because it's a 4-hour bus drive. So like my samples would die by the time they got here. But there are other labs, like Larry's lab collaborated with a lab at HSS. And so the student would go down to HSS and the surgeon there would like do the surgeries on, they were doing like a sheep model. And so he like stay for the weekend and get all these surgeries on sheep's done. And then like they would like be sent back here. There's other people who, Marilane's lab, for example, some students have like weekly call-ins with the surgeons there, and like they might be analyzing things like MRI data from like arthroplasty or something. And so they like actually call in every week and present like one of their aims is like based on HSS data. And so they will like present that to the clinicians and like vice versa. And like they will like, that student also gets to hear like about the clinical work that's being done at HSS. So it kind of depends on the lab, like, and people like, and I don't think like all of the PIs like have connections with these HSS people. So like, it's really up to you to kind of drive that forward if you're interested in it. So it's definitely like a possibility. I know our lab is also trying to get something set up with an orthopedic surgeon more locally in Ithaca, just because of like, we want human samples and Ithaca is closer than New York City. And so that's also an option too.